Veterans for Peace Forum. I want to welcome you back. We have our program on every fourth Saturday of the month, and I want to dedicate today's program to Melanie Sylver, who just passed away, and for Mumia AbuJamal, who's in critical condition right now in a prison hospital. Now, Melanie is a good friend of my producer here, both Kelly Labonte and Jim Lockhart, and they've been very close to her, been at her bedside. Melanie just passed away. I think it was it yesterday, and she is also known as A.K. Sister Sativa. She passed away yesterday afternoon. She was a good friend of so many people, an activist, a wonderful heart, and we need to remember her, and I want to dedicate this program to her. And also to Mumia AbuJamal. I just got an email, actually a Facebook posting as of today, that he is in serious critical condition. Mumia AbuJamal was framed by the Philadelphia police in murder of a policeman, and a long trial that took place that even the judge said they needed to hang that N-word person. A long racist attack, because he was also a member of the Black Panther Party, and they brought his political affiliations into the trial to sway the white juries against him. He was on death row for many, many years, 20 some odd years, and we finally got him released from death row and put into the prison community. And he has diabetes, and his diabetes was not being taken care of properly by the medical professionals in the hospital. He went into a diabetic coma. They wouldn't allow his wife or anybody to see him, his lawyers. And through a lot of protests, we got that available, and he was starting to get a little bit better. And again, his wife just went and saw him and said that he can barely speak, move, very critical, and they're not allowing him the proper care. And in my opinion, and opinion of many of us that have been following his case for many years, they're trying to kill him. They couldn't execute him. And so the prison system itself is trying to kill him with by his own illness. That needs to be taken care of. They could be charged. I think that the officials and the prisoners could be and should be charged with cruel and unusual punishment. They need to provide for his care. That's just a human right. Please, if you can just check out freemumia.com and find out more information. You can call the prisons, you can call the governor. We need to make those phones ring off the hook. We need to flood their emails. And we should also be talking about, I'm a diabetic from Agent Orange from Vietnam, and diabetics, we need to watch our diets. We need to take special care in our health. And So I think the diabetic associations, the foundations, and every diabetic should be on the phone saying this is cruel and unusual, and we need to make sure this doesn't happen. So the program is again dedicated to Melanie Sylver and for Mumia AbuJamal, and then I also want to talk about May Day is coming up shortly, and for those people who don't know, that May Day is also considered International Workers' Day all around the world. And this is the history of the 8-hour day. May 1st, 1886, over 300,000 workers walked off the job in the United States. Shortly after, there was the Hay Day Massacre. There was somebody who threw an explosive into the middle of a crowd and killed some people, and then the police went after what they considered some of the leaders of that group, and hung a few of those people, and a trial was sort of trumped up. But we need to remember that shortly after that, people all over the world and we all have benefited by the 8-hour day. and that workers and people throughout the world celebrate that day as International Workers' Day. So, you know, we need to get out on the streets. So this, there's going to be a rally in Portland. At 2 p.m. there's going to be a gathering. 3 p.m. there's going to be a rally at the South Park blocks, Southwest Salmon and Southwest 9th. And at 4 p.m. we're going to march. We've had, you know, 5,000 to 10,000 people in the streets before on May Day. We've had a few thousand sometimes. This is a time. This is also the year, you know, that we've been struggling for 15 hours now. $15 now, excuse me, it's not 15 hours. 15 now. Workers that are getting underpaid just for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And this is moving stronger and stronger all throughout the nation. We need to get into the streets and support that. So I wanted to bring that up. I just got a email from, actually again, a Facebook post by a friend of mine, Julie T. Underhill, called Vietnamese Comfort Women Speak. It's just a new post that came out, and you might want to check that out. You know, you could go to Google this information, but just as of April 25th, it was a news article that said Vietnamese war victims speak of sexual violence by South Korean troops for the first time. And you're talking 40 years after the end of the war. And this is also the 50th year after, from the beginning of the war, so-called, when the Marines landed in, and the Koreans landed in Vietnam. So I'm also involved in an organization called, well, Veterans for Peace, but we have a program, a campaign called Vietnam Full Disclosure. And that came out of the fact that the Department of Veterans, the Department of Defense, actually has $65 million to do a 10 to 13 year campaign to rewrite the history of the Vietnam War. And not that they're saying lies, it's what they're not saying that is important. What they're doing is trying to rah-rah sort of a military recognition of those people that fought in that war by handing out medals, bringing people up to talk about it. There are heroes in war, and those to me are the heroes that were the medics that went out and saved lives, those people who refused to fight the war. There was a whole movement called the GI resistance movement, where thousands, hundreds of thousands of veterans decided that they weren't going to participate in the war anymore. They were conscientious objectors. There were those that were draft dodgers. There were those that went to Canada. And there's a whole history of the anti-war movement. That is an important story to tell when we talk about these things. And we can't let history be written by just one side. There's more perspectives that need to be brought together so that everybody can understand the truth. And somewhere, you know, we all have a story. We all have something that needs to be told, and we need to archive those. So we have, with Full Disclosure, we have a website, and you can just Google Full Disclosure, Vietnam Full Disclosure. .org, and you will find this wonderful website in which many, many stories are being put and archived there. The history of the war is being continually written about, and we have historians, we have writers, we have poets, we have veterans telling their stories, their individual stories. They're talking about the cost of war. And we need those stories to be told so that people understand that, you know, if we're ever going to create peace in the world, we're going to have to find a way to stop people from joining the military and fighting with other people. That there's always somebody who's the other. There's always somebody in which those people who are in power to make these decisions are sending off, you know, our young men and women off to war. And I think we need to stop that. So please check that out. I think you'll be, you know, we're doing teach-ins. I'm planning on trying to do a teach-in at Portland State in sometime around November. I'm also working with the Oregon Historical Society to look into the May 1970 student anti-war movement at Portland State University at that time. And I remember that. I was at Portland Community College, which was then, they had Shattuck Hall, which is now part of PSU. But I was in a class, a creative writing class, in fact, and I just came out of that class and we were taking a break and I was looking out in the park blocks. And as a Vietnam veteran, I'm watching these anti-war folks out there, students out there, you know, sort of almost camping out. And all of a sudden, you know, there was these, first time I'd really seen SWAT teams, these RoboCops, and now we see them everywhere. But they went through there and started beating people, and I was horrified by it, but I didn't know how to respond to it at the time. I just trying to get on with my life and not be involved or think about these things. Although I was very disturbed by it, and the memory keeps coming back, and the memory of those days are important to tell because it's a Portland story. It's something that you should know about, and we need to expand that history so that everybody remembers and understands. Many of the people that were involved in that live here in Portland, and they have their stories to tell. So that's where we are right now. I just recently went to Julie is a good friend. Julie T. Underhill is a good friend of mine. She's a writer, an artist, so many things, a teacher. She's teaching at Berkeley in ethnic studies. And I met her quite a while back. I think she was only 19, maybe 20. I knew she couldn't go out for a drink, and she had already been doing films, and she saw that I was wearing probably something that said Veterans for Peace, and she came up to me and said, "Well, you're a veteran. My father was a veteran. Have you read this book?" And I said, "Well, what book are you talking about?" She says, "Smedley Butler's book, War is a Racket." And if you haven't read that, he was one of the most highly decorated Marines. His book, after he retired, he wrote this book, War is a Racket, and he talks about how, as a military general, he was a thug for the corporations and exploiting people in other countries. So it's a great book. It's the one that's inspired so many veterans, myself, and a lot of young Iraq and Afghan vets have read that book, especially us Marines. I was a Marine in Vietnam. So that's a very inspirational book. But Julie sent me this posting about an author that was coming to town, and Nguyen wrote a book called The Sympathizer, and I had read such great reviews on the book, and he was at Powell's bookstore, and I had to go out and see him. I just thought it was an incredible story, and every time anything there's about Vietnam, I was just telling you about how veterans need to tell their stories and how other people need to talk about the war, either through fiction, through history, through however people need to talk about these things. But oftentimes we don't hear the Vietnamese voice in those stories. And I think we need to hear their voices as well. And Viet was born in Vietnam, raised in America. His stories have appeared in the best new American voices. It's narratives and the Chicago Tribune. He's an author of the academic book Race and Resistance. He teaches English and American Studies at the University of Southern California and lives in Los Angeles. He's on a book tour right now. You can actually Google him and you'll find there's been some Cable Radio did an interview with him. I think NPR just did an interview with him. So you can pick up those interviews and learn more. It's an extraordinary story. He tells he's a great reader, and he has a great sense of humor, but very serious about some of these things. And, I wanted to get him on this program. And, of course, he couldn't be here. He had to leave the next day. But he announced this young woman in the audience, Dao Strom, who he said was also an author, and that, you know, we gave her a big applause. He mentioned her books and the work that she was doing. And afterwards, we went out for a drink and we had a little talk. And it was such a great pleasure to meet Dao. And I want to introduce you to her. Dao, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for
I
having
know that
me.
was a long introduction to get you here, but I want to thank you so much for coming to the program. Now, Dao has her own project. She's an author. She's a musician, artist, all of those things. And tell me a little bit about your history. I can read a little bit here. Let me do a little introduction. Dao is a daughter of writers. She fled Vietnam with her mother at the end of the war. It was not until years later that she learned that her father was still alive and that he had spent a decade in the communist reeducation camps and as persecution for his work as a writer in pre-1975 era Saigon. Right?
Yes.
This riff caught between the forward-looking mother, right?
Well, it's basically my that's from the summary of the memoir that I've been working on. My mother and father were both writers in Saigon before 1975. Actually, my mother was pretty well known. She, both of them, they ran a newspaper together. It was called Song Tan, and their newspaper was pretty controversial because they, were kind of trying to expose corruption in the military and the government. And I wouldn't say that they were neither, pro-communist or pro-South Vietnamese government. I think they recognized that there was corruption in both regimes. And at the fall of Saigon, my father decided to stay in the country, and my mother left with me and my brother, and we ended up in the States, and that's where I grew up. But many years later, I found out that I'd always been told my father was dead, actually, that he had died in the war. And then when I was a teenager, my mother told me that he actually was still alive and had spent a long time in the communist re-education camps, which is what happened to a lot of people who stayed in the country. Anyone who was affiliated with Americans or who were, teachers or writers or intellectuals were put into these forced labor camps. So that's part of the history that I've come out of.
Kind of like being forced to go to schools that won't tell the whole history anymore.
Well, yeah,
No.
they were quite, I mean, my father was
the
locked in isolation, and they were quite difficult
prison
circumstances.
Yeah, work camp. One of the things I noticed about your work, both Viet was saying too, is these caught between, world between. Can you talk a little bit about that? I don't know what that means.
Just being between cultures, between circumstances. I don't speak Vietnamese. I grew up with a Vietnamese mother and a Danish-American stepfather, and I grew up in a rural part of California. So I didn't really grow up, in a Vietnamese-American community either. So a lot of my work deals with being in between spaces, in between communities, not really feeling like I belong in one or the other. And so I guess that's a big part of it. I think maybe a lot of Vietnamese people and maybe a lot of Vietnamese Americans do feel a certain amount of pull from both sides because, we really are, like a lot of people my age are the first generation growing up, Americanized, but having still in our past this circumstance of war and having to leave Vietnam. And then there's just the battle of having the generations, really. Like there's the older generation, the Vietnamese generation, our parents, the way they feel about things and the way, the younger generation feels. There's a lot of differences. And in Vietnamese history, and I think Viet's book really kind of tackles some of the divisiveness that I think somebody was saying that maybe at the reading specifically, maybe he'd said it where, you know, it wasn't just a war against, you know, they say it was a war of independence for Vietnam, but it wasn't really a war of independence necessarily. It was more of a civil war. It's, you know, the North and South division was what the conflict was really about. So you have like a divided people, and then, you know, so it wasn't really a war of Vietnam versus America either. It was like, if you know, look into it, it has a lot to do with the divisiveness that was, you know, between North and South Vietnam, between the communists and between.
But there is a I think it's all those things, you know.
It's a complicated war.
Yes, it's a complicated war, and I think too. I mean, we talk about it from the States, we talk about the Vietnam War, but it's also called the American War.
Yeah.
Vietnam, and but you know, in the beginning, Ho Chi Minh actually had called upon the Congress to be you know, the president to support their movement of independence. And you know, they just got rid of the French, and then they were even writing the Constitution after the U.S. Constitution. But the U.S. decided that it was going to support a whole different regime, even after their own advisors had requested that you know, we might make friends. Again, it's this thing like same thing happened in Cuba. You know, in Cuba, in the sense when Fidel actually had support in the beginning to overthrow Batista. You know, and but afterwards, when he said he was a communist, and they were looking at you know, really getting rid of the corporate-owned businesses in that country, the U.S. and the corporations went nuts, and they did everything they could to overthrow the Cuban government. So even in Vietnam, I talked to, you know, when I went back in 2006. You went back in '96.
Yeah, and last year.
And last year.
Yeah.
When I was there, I was talking with some old generals, you know, and they were telling me that, you know, I mean, I should be careful. they did not, they were not as concerned about communism as they were about the independence. And even now that, you know, the government was very strict for many years, I was talking to them about the opening up of the economy to the World Trade Organization, and now we're dealing with the TPP coming up, these negotiations with in the Asian community, I mean the Asian markets, and these sort of trade deals are just putting people under tremendous pressure. One of the things that they told me is, they said, look, you know, our people suffered for a long, long time in poverty for us to hold on to an ideology. Very, you know, I thought that was very revealing. And he says, you know, and it's hard to give up an ideology when you fought for it and people died for it. That goes both sides, Vietnam, U.S., wherever you're from, South Vietnamese. It's hard to give up that idea. And then there was this, he says, but I look at South Korea and they have a booming economy, you know, and I look at these other countries that are doing well, and I said, was the war worth it?
Yeah.
You know, was the war worth it? What could we have done? Does that mean we would have been, something else would have happened? There was a oppression of some other form by maybe corporate heads instead. But whatever it would be, he says, now is the time for us to change, and now is the time for us to look to resolve our past. And me as a veteran, you know, I feel guilty of being a part of a system, of a country that sent our military there to Vietnam and to kill Vietnamese. For what?
It's really complicated.
Very complicated.
Situation.
It just, I mean, that's our story. But there's also this, again, like I said, the story of the Vietnamese. What I liked about Viet's book is he talks about it as this spy, this fiction.
Yeah.
He's a spy in between.
Yeah, the main character in his book is a communist spy who is embedded in the South Vietnamese army,
Right.
and then at the fall of Saigon, he is given orders to emigrate to the U.S. to escape with the South Vietnamese army, supposedly to keep spying on them, but of course, he also starts having the immigrant experience. So he really is a character that's has a lot of different viewpoints, contained within his own perspective, which is what makes the book interesting. And I think it's I think it might be the first book that's American published that has a Vietnamese protagonist as a main character, and that kind of deals with the Vietnam War, which I think is just it's part of the process of adding dimension to the history of Vietnam and how we understand it and how we think about it. Just having that South Vietnamese viewpoint, or having that Vietnamese viewpoint in the mix is.
So when you first went back, what was your experience when you went back?
It was really, I was young. It was pretty emotional for me. I met my father for the first time. I can just remember that I really had no expectation. I grew up with parents, my mother and my stepfather, really being the type of people that believe that you sever yourself from the past and you move on. And so I didn't really have a lot of sentimentality about, expectations going back. And one of the things that struck me going back was that it was very emotional, even though I didn't remember anything. I don't have any personal memories. I was really young when I left. So there definitely is this collective feeling of, trauma and sorrow and what the country has been through. I met my father and his family, and it was a life-changing trip for me to go back that first time, and then I went back last year, and it's changed a lot. The country's it's growing. It's
Did you travel all over the country?
I traveled, started in Hanoi and went south, and I saw it's a crowded, crazy, chaotic place.
How did you travel? Did you go by
some
bike
by bus, and and then we rented a motorbike when my husband was with me, and we did some trips, around, and we actually, one of the things I really wanted to do was go and see some of the Champa ruins, which is the ancient civilization, really the equivalent of the indigenous, people of the Vietnamese. And I wanted to see some of those ruins and take some pictures there. And actually, there's some of that in the new book that I worked on. So that was one of the highlights of returning.
You want to say something about the Cham also? I mean, they.
Well, just historically, they are, it's. I guess there's no. Julie would know a lot more because she actually is part Cham. But they are a civilization that was there before the Vietnamese, actually, and they had a flourishing civilization in the central and south part of Vietnam. They built beautiful temples, pottery, artwork, music, and it's, as far as I can tell, just as the history, it seems that their civilization is Hindu influenced, and that kind of figures, you can see it in the architecture, and they were absorbed into the Vietnamese culture somewhere, in the 15th century, which basically means the Vietnamese conquered them. But there are a number of minority tribes existing in Vietnam, and the Cham are just one of them.
Yeah, and Julie's studies I thought were pretty interesting, because I had not thought when she was doing her studies that, I thought of Buddhists and then the Hindu part. They were both Buddhist and Hindu and Islamic.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I think that came a little bit later for them. But yeah, I mean, for me, the interesting part is just, the question of what is Vietnamese and what does it mean to be Vietnamese. And what I've heard a lot of growing up is the fact that, the Vietnamese have fought wars for the past 1,000 years, like against the Chinese, against, before the French, Americans. And so there's this long history of fighting, and there's this long, that's a really, there's a warrior spirit in the culture. And I guess, I'm interested in like what comes before the fighting.
There were
also
the women warriors.
Yeah, there's the legend of the women warriors. And I haven't answered the question exactly for myself, but there is a feeling of like, who are people before they have to fight? Because there's so much identification with this, I'm trying to find the right word, but people identified by having to fight for their independence and defend their country, which from invaders, and I guess in a spiritual sense or in just an essential sense, I'm kind of interested in like exploring that question of who are we before that, and I don't know that I've answered that.
Yeah, no, that's a difficult one. We're dealing with that with the indigenous populations of the Americas. My wife is also Mexican American. Her grandmother and grandfather from Mexico are from Texas, but we're part of both Mexico and Apache. And so we have this long history of people. Oftentimes, I told you earlier that I was a part of MECHA, the Chicano Student Organization at Portland State University, and we'd often say, people talk about immigrants coming into this country and how they came across the border, and we would always say, no, the border crossed over us, because they were all the way up here in Oregon, and so and we deal with those things, and then there's there's this long history in the U.S. of racism, and Portland being a center of Ku Klux Klan and others. White supremacy here in the United States. I found growing up that, I would always, like I think I told you before, I was always considered myself a person of color because my father was born in Panama, and I identified with our Latino history. But, I had white privilege, and I didn't know what that meant. My brother was darker, and he suffered more because of that. And I, as I grew wiser with age, and after Vietnam, seeing that, we're going back to Vietnam and speaking with people, and finding that, we're all the same. We all care about our children. We all care about trying to put a roof over our heads. We want, we want to do our art, our music, our job, whatever it might be. And, people don't have the desire to kill other people. It's just not. I don't think it's natural. I think that is something that politics does. It's with politics of people that are pushing for things that they want, or to take. Actually, I think that would be a better word. They want to take from somebody else. That convince people through issues of the other, create racism in order to. I think it's a manipulative process. I think you have to teach people to be racist. I think, and we can unlearn that, folks. I think that if you begin to know people, expand your experiences besides your home or your own community, and learn about other cultures. Language is a great way to learn about other cultures. Travel outside in your own environment and learn to speak to people, and you'll find out when you know somebody, you care about them and you don't want to harm them, and vice versa, they care about you. So I think those are important things. But you are, you're an author, a musician. Can you tell us about your book? This is your recent. Should I hold it up? Oh, it's like it's called "We Were Meant to Be a Gentle People," and I've been working on it. For a while. It's more of a hybrid work, and I'll just flip to one.
I guess one of the things I'm interested in exploring is image and text and kind of how they relate. And there's this one image here, which I don't know if you'll be able to see.
Yeah, I can see that.
But this is an image that appeared in Time magazine in May 1975, like right at the fall of Saigon. And it's taken from Camp Pendleton. It's a line of children, refugees. And my brother is actually one of the boys in this
Is that
picture.
right?
Yeah. And so, you know, it's a picture that my mother had kept, you know, like we had it in our history. And so I guess for me with this book, it's just I have an interest in exploring just the intersection between the personal and the collective, and kind of where like the documentary images and concept of Vietnam like mixes with the personal. And there's a few other images in there since my mother was a journalist, and there's a few pictures that are from archives of a photographer friend of hers that I also use in the book and just talk about. And so for me, there's the historical, political, but then there's also these personal stories behind it too. And I'm just exploring that
But
meeting point a little
now
bit.
you also do music.
I do music, and I don't know how to explain. I started out as a writer, and then somewhere like in my early 20s, I discovered music, and I started playing music, and I was really drawn into music initially, roots and folk music, like old, old kind of, and it's another form of storytelling, so that's part of what's interesting about it. And I guess, just this trying to get back to like music is a really essential way of people communicating. And in Vietnam, there's actually a tradition of folk music called ca dao, and it's like oral. It's a way of telling stories that's done through song,
Right.
And which I think, obviously American folk music does that too. Like every culture has music that does that. So
So you're a songwriter. You write your own songs.
yeah. And I find I enjoy music as a different way of communicating.
Would you, you
wanna-
brought your guitar. Would you be willing to play a song for us?
Sure.
And I'm going to bring this microphone up here. I think this.
Okay. Is that good location? All right. I wrote this song a long time ago, and it's actually about a river in Vietnam, so it's I thought it would be appropriate. In the Perfume River, neath the waters deep, my baby lay crying as she fell asleep. I was running with her there in my arms, tripped on a stone, hidden by the dark. Oh, Perfume River, you keep me running. I'll travel the world to escape your curse, but for those ones whose souls run deep as your dark green waters, no place is home. They say a bomb is like an orphan, lands anywhere she can. Mother's flying home as the skies are bursting. Bright orange fire rains where the gods once dwelt. Oh, Perfume River, you keep me running. escape your curse, but for those ones whose souls run deep as your dark green waters, no place is home. Far from your dark green waters, no place is home.
When you said you were doing a river, I thought, Perfume River?
That's a very famous river, yeah.
Yeah, that was great. With this music, you're interplaying that with your let's put this back down here, with your text
Yeah.
music, and is that a video project? Is that
Well, there's an album that goes along with that is kind of a companion piece to the book. And it's kind of a two-part album. It's called East-West, so there's two geographies. And some of the songs explore a little bit of the folk mythology of Vietnam, and then some of the West songs are just, I guess, my interpretation of certain mythic qualities of the West.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the concept between it.
so? And can people see that? Where do they see that? You should
Well, I
tell
am
them.
going to release it all this summer. My website is the best place to find the information, but it'll be on, eventually I'll get it up on Amazon and iTunes. But I am going to do an event on May 12th.
May 12th?
At Alberta Street Pub. And it's a kind of a literary music night, and it's put on by Tell It Slant Reading Series. And we're calling it a fourth genre night, which is because again, it's that space in between where there are going to be four performers, and I'm one of them. And there's combination of music and literature basically being performed.
Okay, and your website is www.daostrom, DAOSTROM.com.
Yeah.
And from there you can link to your Facebook and, other work that you're doing.
You'll find it on the website.
Okay. You had sent me information about Vu Pham.
Vu Pham, yeah. He's a friend of mine. He's also a Portland artist. He's a filmmaker and also Vietnamese-American origin. He was born in Vietnam, and he grew up in Portland. Mm-hmm. I met him just a couple of years ago, kind of actually through another writer, Andrew X. Pham, which I don't know if you're aware of him, but he's also, Viet knows him as well. But Vu has a screening coming up at Cinema 21, and
May 12th.
His
is when?
May 2nd.
May 2nd, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't have
May
that
3rd.
date on there.
And
Alberta,
he has 3 short films that he is screening under the name Love is Strong.
Love is
all
Strong.
3 of them deal with relationships in some degree or another.
Well, you can also go to Cinema 21 and look up the films that are coming in. It's a great theater, a long history with that theater. And I've worked with the management over there before, and they do terrific work. And they've got a number of new theaters there. They've actually fixed up and have new seating in the major theater there, and they have a couple of other little theaters on the side, all brand new. A great place to go see a film. Great history from that theater. This is great. So, is he a writer also then?
He's a writer-director,
Writer-director.
and actor as well.
Well, thank you for bringing that to our attention, because I definitely want to see that. Maybe we can all go out together. That'd be fun. That'd be fun to do. So now, tell me about your your books that you have here and the information you have here.
I have 2 previous books. The first one isn't here actually, but Grass Roof, Tin Roof was my first novel. And
Show that if if we can get.
And this is The Gentle Order of Girls and Boys, which was published in 2006. And it's a collection of 4 stories, short stories, or novellas, I call them.
Mm-hmm.
And each of them are about a woman of Vietnamese American background or some, but they really are just stories about, women's lives. And my first novel, Grass Roof, Tin Roof, is more, not exactly autobiographical, but about a mixed cultural family, very similar to my own, growing up in a town very similar to the one I grew up in. And then I've done a couple solo albums, and this one is, the song that I sang is on that one.
And this is, Dao Strom's Send Me Home.
Yeah, I recorded that in Austin, Texas, and it's just a song.
And where can they get this?
That one is on iTunes. It's also on cdbaby.com, which is, the local Portland-based outlet for independent music.
Can they get it at Music Melanie?
I do not know. I have not put it there. It's just, yeah. But the easiest way is just to go online.
And this
if you
here?
Google it, you'll find it. And this one is this is the East album, and the artwork is done by a dear friend of mine who's this amazing artist, Christine Nguyen, and she lives in LA. She does these photo-based works. But this is the East half of the album that I'm releasing this summer. So.
So, in your book, you're telling stories, right? Tell us a story.
That's why I write them.
Well, just a little bit. What about reading a piece out of there?
Oh, gosh, I'm not prepared to do that. There was like a short little piece. Really?
Yeah, try it. That's fine.
Read the one about my brother.
Yeah, just do a little bit. You don't have to read it all. Just,
all right. Well, this is
us
talking
flavor.
about the photograph that I talked about earlier, the one that was taken from Camp Pendleton. My brother is the boy in the middle of this photograph. It's from 1975, just after the fall of Saigon, and the photo was taken at Camp Pendleton where we had landed. The photograph appeared in Time magazine, and my mother snipped it and kept it. My brother is the one caught in mid-expression, with his eyes partially closed and his mouth open, as if he were about to speak or yawn just at the moment the picture was snapped. Behind him, there are 2 boys looking away, looking backwards. We see only the backs of their heads, the oversized bulk of their borrowed green field jackets. The girl in front of my brother looks forward and seems fairly unperturbed, comfortable enough in the jacket that keeps her warm, and we might assume she is the kind who will do fine. But it's the one in front of her who, for me, begins to give the picture away. This child could be boy or girl with that androgynous, longish, short haircut, and he or she is the only one who appears to notice the camera and is actually looking, with brows slightly furrowed, in the direction of the picture's shooter. All the green coat fabric creates an appearance of the children standing in a forest, the background foliage of which is made up of more of those same green jackets, but worn by the taller figures of men whose height exceeds the camera person's framing of the shot. Those men are very likely the GIs at Camp Pendleton, whom my brother says we used to cling to the legs and dangle from the arms of, swinging and playing like monkeys, in our first weeks and months of life in America.
That's good. That's good. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I was just thinking when you were talking about that was also how you were talking about form, music. I mean, writing and form. So you said you were when we were talking after Viet's talk about pushing the form in a different way. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I have a hard time drawing inside the lines or coloring inside the lines in general in my life and in my, my attempts at making art. I had I studied creative writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I studied with James McPherson, who's an African-American author, and he was, one thing he said to me about my work at one point was, he said, well, you're writing about an unconventional family, so the form that you should use should be unconventional. Mm-hmm. And that is probably one of the most useful pieces of advice that I received as a writer, because I was always struggling to structure things in a way that fit. And so my works kind of tended to, I guess, not be very conventional, and to traverse the boundaries between, fiction and nonfiction, or prose and poetry, and music and writing as well, and then, adding visuals in. I studied film in my undergraduate years, so I do have an interest in the visual medium as well. So I guess that's part of the reason
why.
Well,
that's a great explanation. I mean, that's a creative process in pushing all these boundaries. I always try to teach, when I was teaching art, to people to go outside the lines, to think beyond that. But well, since we're getting close to the end here, I kind of would like to hear another song from you, if you're willing to do that.
Sure.
And I'll put that up. And,
okay. Well, all right. I'll play another one off of that first album. Sure. It's a simple little song. It's called My Little Angel.
Dearest darling, my only one, my little angel, where have you gone? I heard a voice calling you away one night as we lay sleeping in our beds where we felt safe. A mother's worst fears came to light on that day when my little angel was carried away down to the the night. I followed that voice calling, followed its plight, and holy, holy, holy was the sight of my little angel glowing in the night. Promised me I'll return safely. I'll surely escape these bonds of eternity. You'll hear me calling, calling as I run. I'll meet you by the river, Mama, when I am done. just the same. In spite of the ways your boy might have changed, I'll tell you stories of all the wicked things that I have seen, and then I'll become your little angel once again. And then I'll become your little angel once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. You have one more? A short one?
I do, but aren't you almost out of time?
Yeah, we are almost out of time. Let's put that down here. Let's finish up here. So you also work in collaboration with Julie on what's it? Diacritic?
I am also a writer and editor, contributing writer and editor to diacritics.org, which is a blog, but also kind of an online journal. Vietnamese American, not just American, but Vietnamese diasporic arts and culture. So really a lot of great content, and Viet is the editor-in-chief of that, which is one of the ways I work with him. And Julie also writes a lot of fantastic articles for it.
It's a great place for folks to look at your work and incredible work.
Yeah.
There's also something that both you and Viet were talking about, is this rising Vietnamese art culture that's coming out. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Just really, it's a new thing. It's a lot of the Vietnamese American.
Well, we're just coming up. A lot of Vietnamese Americans are.
It's really the first generation of people in this particular.
I've got to just say
sorry.
we're at the end here. I went a little too far, but I want to thank you for coming here and for bringing your music, your books, everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.